The night shift always began the same way in Hawthorne State Hospital, with fluorescent lights humming like tired insects and the smell of antiseptic never quite masking the age of the building. And for Marcus Hale, it was supposed to be just another quiet rotation, another long stretch of hours spent charting vitals, checking doors, and listening to the distant echo of a place that never truly slept. Because Hawthorne was old, older than the newer wings suggested, and its walls had learned how to hold sound the way lungs hold breath, never fully releasing it. Marcus had been working here for 8 months, long enough to know the rhythms of the building, long enough to recognize which noises meant malfunction and which meant nothing at all, and long enough to understand that nights were when the hospital showed its real shape, when hallways felt subtly longer and corners seemed to lean inward. But nothing in his experience prepared him for the patient listed at the very bottom of the intake board, the name written neatly but never erased, never discharged, never transferred. Patient E47. He noticed it because the chart was too clean, untouched by the layers of edits and scribbles that marked every other long-term resident, and when he asked about it during handover, the day nurse hesitated just long enough to make the silence noticeable before saying that E47 was stable, compliant, lucid, and under strict instruction not to be escorted outside the building under any circumstances. That alone would have been strange, but what unsettled Marcus was the casual way she added that the patient had requested the restriction himself, years ago, and that every attempt to reassess it had ended badly. Not violently, not dramatically, just badly in a way that left people shaken and unwilling to try again. The file said the patient had no recorded delusions, no hallucinations, no psychotic episodes, and psychological evaluations repeatedly described him as remarkably grounded, which made the next line impossible to ignore. Exhibits extreme panic response when exposed to exit thresholds. Marcus laughed it off at first, assuming it was shorthand for agoraphobia or trauma-related anxiety. But something about the phrasing felt wrong. Clinical words stretched over something they didn't quite fit. His rounds brought him past E-Wing shortly after midnight, a section of the hospital that always felt colder no matter the season, and as he walked, he became aware of how quiet it was. Not the peaceful quiet of sleeping patients, but the heavier kind. The kind that pressed inward and made his footsteps sound intrusive. E47's room was at the end of the corridor, not isolated but subtly set apart, as if the architecture itself had nudged it farther from the others over time. And when Marcus reached the door, he found it open, the patient sitting calmly on the bed, hands folded, posture relaxed, eyes alert and focused not on the wall or the floor, but on the doorway itself, as though he had been waiting. There was nothing remarkable about the man's appearance. No scars, no restraints, no vacant stare. Just a man in his late 40s, hair graying at the temples, eyes sharp in a way that suggested careful attention rather than paranoia. And when Marcus introduced himself, the patient smiled faintly and said his name with a familiarity that made Marcus pause, not because it was threatening, but because it was accurate, pronounced exactly the way Marcus preferred. "My name is E47, the patient said quietly. The conversation was brief and polite, almost disappointingly normal, until Marcus mentioned, casually, that the weather outside had finally started to warm, and the patient's expression changed, not dramatically, but precisely, like a system switching states, his shoulders tensing, his gaze flicking past Marcus toward the corridor beyond, as if something had just moved there. "I don't like hearing about outside," he said calmly. "It makes things restless." When Marcus asked what he meant, the patient gestured subtly around the room and said that the hospital listened, that it had learned to respond to certain ideas, certain movements, and that leaving wasn't a matter of walking through a door, but of breaking a balance that had taken decades to stabilize. Marcus dismissed it internally as poetic language, the kind patients sometimes developed to make sense of confinement. But as he stepped back into the corridor, he noticed the lights flicker once, just once, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to make him stop and look back. The patient was still seated, watching the doorway, his expression apologetic, as if he'd warned Marcus too late. Over the next few hours, Marcus became acutely aware of small deviations in the hospital's behavior. Doors that took an extra second to unlock, intercom feedback where there had never been any, the sensation that the building's temperature shifted depending on where he stood. And every time something felt off, he found his thoughts drifting back to E47, to the way the man had spoken about Hawthorne, not as a place, but as something closer to a condition, a containment. Just before the end of his shift, Marcus checked the archived patient logs out of idle curiosity and found something that made his stomach tighten. The earliest record of E47 dated back over 30 years. The handwriting different, but the wording consistent. Every evaluation concluding the same thing. Every attempted discharge marked as deferred. And in the margin of one yellowed page, written in faded ink, a note he was certain had not been typed into any modern system. A simple sentence, underlined twice. Patient is not confined by the hospital. Patient is the reason it holds. The second night begins without a clear boundary, because in a place like this, there is no real difference between days, only a gradual deepening of the same stale darkness. And the guard feels it the moment he steps back inside the hospital, as if the building has been waiting for him specifically. The air thicker than before, carrying that faint chemical smell mixed with something older and organic, like damp paper and rusted metal. And the first thing he notices is that the corridor clocks are no longer synchronized, each one showing a slightly different time, all of them wrong by a few minutes, which he tries to explain away as poor maintenance, even though yesterday they were perfectly aligned. And as he makes his rounds, the sounds begin to change, not louder, but more deliberate. Footsteps that stop when he stops. The distant scrape of something heavy being dragged across tile far below the surface floors. And occasionally, a soft knock from behind walls that should only contain sealed rooms and abandoned offices. And when he reaches the nurse's station, the logbook he filled out the previous night is open to a page he does not remember writing, the handwriting matching his own, but tighter, more urgent, repeating the same line 3 times. Do not acknowledge them when they stand still. And as he reads it, the intercom crackles without warning, not with a voice, but with a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat slowed almost to failure. And the lights dim in response, as if the building itself is breathing in, holding that breath just a little too long. And during his next round, he notices the patient charts outside the old rooms have changed. Names crossed out and replaced with blank labels. Dates altered so that admissions stretch forward into years that have not happened yet. Discharges marked with symbols instead of signatures. And behind one reinforced door, He sees movement through the narrow window, a figure standing perfectly upright, facing the wall, unmoving despite the sound of the lock engaging on its own. And he tells himself not to look for a face, remembering the rule he does not recall learning. But the figure begins to lean backward at an impossible angle, spine bending without resistance, until its head presses gently against the glass from the inside. Not hard enough to crack it, just enough to fog it with a slow, deliberate exhale. And when he retreats, the intercom activates again, this time producing a distorted imitation of his own voice, repeating a sentence he spoke earlier in the night, word for word, tone flattened, cadence wrong, as if the building is practicing how to sound human. And by the time he returns to the security office, the monitors show feeds that do not correspond to any camera positions he recognizes. Long hallways extending farther than the building's blueprints allow. Doors that open into identical doors again and again. And occasionally, a still frame where a figure stands at the far end of the corridor, not approaching, not retreating, simply waiting. And he understands then that the hospital is no longer passively decaying, but actively reorganizing itself, sorting spaces and memories and people according to rules he does not know. And as the night drags on, he realizes something far worse than the noises or the figures. The exits on the security map are slowly disappearing, one by one, replaced with sealed icons, as if the hospital has decided that nothing inside it should be allowed to leave. By the third night, the hospital no longer pretends to be empty, and the guard feels it before anything visibly changes. A pressure behind the eyes, and a dull ache in the chest that syncs with the building's electrical hum, as if his own body is being tuned to the same frequency. And when he checks in at the security office, the monitors flicker to life without his touch, cycling through camera feeds that show rooms he knows were sealed decades ago, their doors hanging open, beds neatly made as though patients are expected at any moment. And as he begins his rounds, the corridors subtly shift, intersections appearing where straight hallways used to be, familiar turns leading him back to places he already passed. And the soundscape evolves from random noise into patterns, footsteps echoing in groups of 3, pauses lasting exactly 7 seconds, then a single sharp knock somewhere above the ceiling tiles. And in one ward, he finds the reinforced doors standing open, their locks bent outward from the inside, while the rooms beyond are spotless. No signs of struggle, no damage, only the unsettling detail that the walls are covered in faint impressions, as if people once stood there pressed flat against them for hours. And when he examines one closer, the intercom activates again, speaking clearly now in a calm, clinical tone that lists patient numbers instead of names, each followed by a status update that makes no sense. Terms like stabilized, archived, reassigned, and one marked pending confirmation. And he realizes with a growing sense of dread that the voice is no longer imitating him, but drawing from somewhere else, something older and institutional. And the logbook reflects this shift as well. New entries appearing as he walks, documenting events before they happen, noting his movements, his pauses, even his hesitation. And when he reaches the long-term isolation wing, he sees a row of figures standing in the corridor, all facing the walls, exactly as the note warned, completely still, their shadows wrong, stretching upward instead of down, and he forces himself to keep walking, heart pounding, aware that every instinct is screaming for him to look, to confirm they are real. But the moment he passes the last one, the lights cut out entirely, plunging the wing into darkness, broken only by emergency glow strips. And in that dim red light, the figures finally move, not toward him, but in perfect unison, turning their heads just enough for him to hear the soft, wet sound of joints shifting, followed by a chorus of shallow breaths that match the rhythm of the building itself. And when the lights flicker back on, they are gone, leaving behind a single message scratched deep into the floor with something sharp and deliberate, a sentence that freezes him in place because it is written in his own handwriting and ends with a time he has not yet reached, stating simply that the hospital has recognized him as part of its system now, and that observation has entered its final phase. The fourth night begins with the quiet certainty that the hospital is no longer reacting to him, but actively preparing. And this realization settles in as he enters the building to find the security office already unlocked, the lights on, the monitors displaying a single static image of the main corridor, as if waiting. And when he checks the logbook, his name is no longer listed as staff, but as a variable, appended with timestamps that stretch backward years before his birth, suggesting the role existed long before he arrived to fill it. And as he moves deeper into the hospital, the layout stabilizes in an unnatural way. Corridors no longer shifting, but aligning too perfectly, like a finalized blueprint, while the intercom resumes its announcements in a measured cadence, no longer distorted, calmly stating procedural updates about containment thresholds and occupancy limits. And he begins to understand that the hospital is not haunted in the traditional sense, but functioning, carrying out a process that was interrupted decades ago and has now resumed, with him as its reference point. And this becomes horrifyingly clear when he reaches the central records room and finds rows of metal cabinets open, their contents spread across tables in meticulous order. Files documenting patients whose treatments were never completed, whose outcomes were marked inconclusive. And each file includes a photograph that shifts subtly when viewed, eyes slightly misaligned, mouths blurred as if never fully recorded. And as he flips through them, he finds repeated annotations about observational failure, about subjects who became aware of being studied, and therefore unusable. And scattered among these notes are new pages detailing his own behavior, his reactions, his heart rate, even speculative outcomes based on his choices. And the hospital responds immediately when he tries to leave the room, sealing the doors and dimming the lights, while the intercom addresses him directly, not by name, but by designation, informing him that the observation phase requires completion, that exit protocols are suspended, and that resistance will only extend the process. And when the doors finally unlock, he stumbles into a ward he has never seen before, pristine and brightly lit, filled with beds already occupied by figures lying perfectly still under white sheets. And he recognizes the terror instantly, as he realizes they are not patients, but staff, guards, orderlies, technicians from different eras, all wearing uniforms from different decades, all sharing the same hollow stillness. And as he backs away, the hospital's systems hum louder, lights pulsing, machinery activating behind walls, and he understands with sick clarity that the building does not trap people to punish them, but to replace missing components, to keep itself complete, and that his presence has allowed it to resume its original function at full capacity, with only one unresolved variable remaining. The last night does not announce itself with alarms or screams. It arrives quietly, almost respectfully, as if the hospital itself understands that resistance has finally exhausted its purpose, and he walks the corridors with a strange clarity, noticing details that once felt oppressive, now appearing methodical, deliberate, as though every crack in the tiles and every flicker of fluorescent light had always been part of a design rather than decay. And when he reaches the central ward, he realizes it has changed again, expanded without construction, revealing a section he has never seen but somehow remembers. A long room lined with observation windows on both sides, each looking into darkness rather than other rooms, reflecting only his own figure as he passes, thinner now, slower, his posture subtly altered by weeks of sleepless vigilance. And at the far end waits a single bed under a focused light, clean and untouched. Monitors already alive beside it, despite no patient being present, displaying steady diagnostic patterns that do not react to his presence, but seem to anticipate it. And in that moment, the final understanding settles not as fear, but as inevitability. This place was never a prison and never a refuge. It was a system designed to observe the point at which a human mind stops seeking escape and begins to adapt. Because only then can it be measured. And all the patients he had seen were not broken people, but subjects who failed too quickly, who collapsed into madness or silence before the transition could complete. And the staff were never supervisors, but variables, rotated until one remained long enough to comprehend the process without rejecting it. And when he turns to leave the corridor, behind him stretches impossibly long, looping back into itself with gentle precision, not trapping him violently, but guiding him, offering him only one destination. And the realization comes that he has already passed every test by continuing to walk these halls night after night, recording anomalies instead of fleeing them, listening to announcements instead of silencing them, acknowledging the system rather than denying it. And as he approaches the bed, the intercom activates for the first time in hours, its voice no longer distorted or hostile, but neutral, almost clinical, confirming that observation has reached its terminal phase and that manual confirmation is no longer required. And when he hesitates, the hospital responds not with force, but withdrawal. Lights dimming, doors sealing softly, the outside world fading from relevance as exhaustion finally overtakes resolve. And he sits on the edge of the bed, realizing there is no command ordering him to lie down, because compliance is no longer necessary. The system only accepts those who arrive willingly, and as he reclines, the monitors stabilize instantly, lines smoothing into perfect rhythm, the ceiling above dissolving into the familiar network of cracks he has stared at during countless shifts. And memory begins to blur, not through erasure, but reassignment. Details reorganizing themselves into procedural knowledge rather than personal history. And the final announcement echoes once through the ward, stating that system continuity has been restored and observational integrity confirmed. And as consciousness slows, he understands the final truth that makes escape meaningless. The hospital does not consume people. It preserves awareness inside a role. And somewhere far beyond locked doors and sealed files, a new guard signs employment papers, unaware that the building is already listening, already preparing, fully operational once again, waiting patiently for the next mind, capable of lasting long enough to understand why it was never meant to leave. The first thing I noticed when I arrived at Halcyon's Psychiatric Institute was not the building, not the patients, not even the smell of antiseptic that clung to the corridors like a second atmosphere, but the silence between sounds. A strange, disciplined quiet that felt rehearsed, as if the walls themselves knew exactly when to breathe and when to hold it. And I remember thinking that this was odd for a working hospital. Not abandoned, not decaying, but fully staffed and operational, yet lacking the chaotic undertone I had come to expect from places where fractured minds were gathered under one roof. And as a junior psychiatrist on a provisional contract, I told myself this calm was a good sign, a place of routine, of control, of progress. And the orientation materials reinforced that illusion with clean language and neutral terms, emphasizing structure, consistency, and something they called cognitive alignment, which I assumed was just another clinical buzzword until my first group session, when I realized that none of the patients argued with one another, not once, not over memories, not over perceptions, not even over opinions that should have conflicted by their very nature. And these were not catatonic people or heavily sedated shells, but alert individuals, responsive, articulate, and disturbingly synchronized in the way they reacted to questions, nodding at the same moments, pausing for the same length of time, sometimes even shifting in their seats as if responding to a cue I could not hear. And I initially dismissed this as coincidence, the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. Yet the longer I listened, the more uneasy I became. Because when one patient described a sensation, another would quietly acknowledge it without prompting, not as agreement, but as recognition, as if they were confirming a shared observation rather than expressing belief. And later, while reviewing intake files, I discovered that these patients came from different states, different backgrounds, different diagnoses, linked by nothing except the date ranges of their admissions and a recurring note in their early evaluations that read, "Patient exhibits excessive consistency with external accounts." A phrase so vague it might have meant anything. And I asked my supervisor about it during a routine check-in, only to be met with a polite deflection and a reminder that Halcyon specialized in stabilization rather than cure, which sounded reasonable until I noticed that no one here talked about recovery timelines or discharge goals, and that the patients themselves never asked about leaving, not anxiously, not hopefully, not at all, as if the concept of departure had been gently edited out of their expectations. And the strangest part was how comfortable they seemed with that absence, because comfort implies acceptance, and acceptance implies understanding. And I could not shake the growing suspicion that they understood something I did not, something subtle and pervasive, like a draft you only feel once the door has already been left open for too long. And that suspicion sharpened during my third day when, without any prompting, a patient calmly corrected a detail in my notes that I had not spoken aloud. A minor error about the timing of a session that I was certain I had only thought about. And when I asked how he knew, he simply looked at me with a kind of practiced patience, the sort you offer a child who has not yet noticed something obvious, and said nothing. Because at Halcyon, I was beginning to learn silence was not a lack of response, but a complete one. By the end of my first week at Halcyon, I stopped checking the clock. Not because time moved faster, but because it began to feel irrelevant. segmented into identical blocks that repeated with such precision they blurred together. And I noticed that staff schedules mirrored patient routines almost perfectly. Mealtimes aligning, breaks overlapping, conversations occurring in the same corners of the facility, day after day, as if the building itself enforced a rhythm no one questioned anymore. And what unsettled me most was how easily I started following it, my initial discomfort softening into a quiet compliance I could not remember agreeing to. And it was during a routine individual assessment that this compliance first cracked. Because the patient, a middle-aged woman admitted for dissociative episodes, did not describe voices or lost time or fragmented identity as her file suggested. Instead, she spoke calmly about adjustment, about how distress faded once resistance stopped. And as she spoke, I realized she was not describing her symptoms, but my own experience since arriving, referencing moments of confusion I had never documented and doubts I had never shared. And while I maintained a neutral expression, something cold tightened behind my eyes as I understood that this was not intuition or projection, but information, specific and accurate. And when I pressed for clarification, she tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in calibration, as if reassessing how much I was ready to process. And later that evening, I reviewed security footage access logs on a whim I could not fully justify, discovering that my keycard had been used in multiple wings simultaneously during hours I distinctly remembered being elsewhere. And I initially assumed an administrative error until I checked other staff records and found the same impossible overlaps repeating across days and personnel. Patterns that should have triggered investigations, but instead sat unflagged, unremarked, like facts everyone had silently agreed not to see. And the deeper I looked, the more the language of the Institute began to reveal itself as something carefully engineered rather than clinically evolved. Progress notes avoiding causal explanations, incident reports framed as realignments, therapy outcomes measured not in reduced symptoms, but in coherence scores, a term never defined, yet universally referenced. And I began to suspect that Halcyon was less concerned with treating mental illness than with smoothing the rough edges of individual perception, sanding down contradiction until every thought fit neatly within a shared frame. And this suspicion intensified when I attended a staff meeting where a senior clinician casually referenced a patient achieving full convergence, a phrase that drew approving nods without explanation. And in that moment, I understood that whatever was happening here was not hidden at all. It was simply normalized to the point of invisibility. And the realization that frightened me most was not that the patients were being changed, but that I could no longer be sure I was not already in the process of changing with them. Because when I tried to recall my life before Halcyon, the memories felt oddly distant, intact but emotionally hollow, like photographs of places I once lived, but no longer recognized as home. The following days unfolded with a strange double clarity, outwardly routine, yet internally fractured, as I began to notice that my thoughts no longer arrived fully formed, but seemed to be gently guided toward conclusions that felt reasonable before I could question them. And this subtle guidance revealed itself most clearly when I attempted to document my concerns, because every draft of a report criticizing Halcyon's methods ended up rewritten in my own handwriting into something neutral, even supportive. Not crossed out or erased, but smoothly altered, as if I had revised it while forgetting the act itself. And when I tested this by writing a note and immediately photographing it with my phone, I discovered hours later that the photo and the physical page no longer matched. The image now displaying the revised version as well, implying that whatever was shaping perception here did not stop at ink or memory, but extended into recorded reality. And this realization pushed me into a state of quiet panic I could not outwardly express, because emotional spikes were gently but firmly redirected by the environment. Breathing exercises suggested over intercoms I had not activated. Calming phrases appearing on hallway displays that reacted not to movement, but to attention. And I began to understand that Halcyon functioned as a closed cognitive ecosystem, one that detected internal deviation the way a body detects infection, responding not with force, but with correction. And it was during a group therapy observation that the mechanism finally exposed itself, when a patient began describing a recurring dream of endless corridors that rearranged themselves based on expectation. And as she spoke, I realized the room itself was subtly shifting. Not physically, but perceptually. Angles seeming to soften, distances compressing, until I caught my reflection in the glass and saw my own face briefly lag behind my movement, like a delayed signal struggling to keep up. And the patient smiled faintly at that exact moment, not at me directly, but at the realization settling into the room. And she said that the worst part was not losing your sense of self, but discovering how little resistance it took to give it away. And later, alone in my office, I finally accessed an old, unindexed directory buried deep in the system, files predating the Institute's current name, revealing that Halcyon had undergone multiple rebrandings over decades, each corresponding not to scandals or closures, but to shifts in methodology, moving from confinement to conditioning to what they now called alignment. And I understood then that this place did not erase identities. It harmonized them, trimming individuality until dissonance disappeared, creating a population that functioned smoothly because it no longer questioned the frame it operated within. And as this understanding settled, something inside me relaxed in a way that terrified me, because part of me could already see the appeal of a world without internal conflict. And for the first time since arriving, I slept through the night without dreams, waking with a sense of calm so complete it felt like a warning rather than a relief. By the fourth week, the calm had become unmistakably synthetic, a smooth emotional plateau that never dipped or spiked. And what frightened me was not that the Institute had achieved it so effectively, but that my mind had begun to anticipate it, adjusting itself before Halcyon needed to intervene. And this was when I realized the system was no longer merely responding to deviation, but training prediction, shaping not reactions, but intent. Because I would feel a thought begin to form, a question, a doubt, and before it reached language, it would dissolve into something softer, more acceptable, leaving behind only the faint impression that I had almost wondered about something important. And I tested this by deliberately trying to think aggressively disruptive ideas while alone, forcing myself to imagine exposing the Institute, contacting authorities, even imagining violence. Yet each time the thoughts blurred at the edges, not blocked, but gently reframed, until they felt childish, impractical, emotionally exhausting. And I caught myself sighing in relief when they vanished, which was the moment I understood that Halcyon was no longer something acting on me, but something being integrated into me. And this integration revealed itself further when patients began addressing insights I had not spoken aloud, not as revelations, but as shared understandings, as if we were all reading from the same invisible internal script, finishing one another's sentences without words, nodding at conclusions reached in silence. And the group sessions no longer felt like therapy, but like tuning, each person adjusting to the same frequency. And I noticed that those who resisted most strongly were not punished or isolated, but gradually became quieter, their expressions smoothing out, their speech slowing, until they spoke only when spoken to, and eventually not at all. Yet they appeared peaceful, content even, which disturbed me more than overt suffering ever could, because it suggested success rather than failure. And my breaking point came when I finally found my own name listed in a future patient rotation schedule, not as an error or contingency, but as a projected inevitability, complete with behavioral notes written in my voice, describing my progress toward alignment with unsettling precision, noting reduced internal conflict, improved acceptance, and a diminishing need for external validation. And instead of panic, I felt a creeping sense of agreement, because the notes were accurate, and I could not deny that I felt better, lighter, unburdened by constant analysis and doubt. And this internal betrayal pushed me into my last act of resistance, which was not to run or expose the system, but to attempt to preserve something unaligned, a fragment of uncorrected self. And I chose memory as my medium, deliberately recalling moments of intense emotional dissonance from my past, grief, anger, shame, moments that had shaped me precisely because they were unresolved. And as I focused on them, I felt the environment respond immediately. Lights subtly warming, ambient sounds deepening, physiological feedback initiating without prompts. Yet this time, I did not allow the memories to soften. I held them raw, and the strain was immediate and severe. Nausea, dizziness, a splitting headache, as if my mind were overheating. And in that moment, I finally perceived the system clearly, not as walls or technology, but as a constant probabilistic pressure, an omnipresent nudge toward equilibrium that treated instability as inefficiency. And as I collapsed into a chair, barely conscious, I understood that Halcyon's true purpose was not treatment, but evolution. The creation of a human model optimized for internal harmony at the cost of unpredictability. And as alarms quietly triggered around me, not audible but procedural, I realized that my resistance itself was now being measured, categorized, and incorporated. And the most terrifying thought settled in as darkness crept in. Not that I would lose myself, but that I was beginning to believe that losing myself might be the most rational outcome. The final phase did not begin with confinement or sedation, but with permission, a calm authorization to rest, to stop resisting, to let the system complete what it had already calculated. And when I woke, I was no longer in a room that felt clinical, but in a space designed to feel inevitable, softly lit, neutral in every dimension, a place without edges sharp enough to provoke thought. And I understood immediately that this was not recovery, but consolidation, the stage where identity was no longer negotiated, but finalized. Because Halcyon no longer adjusted me in response to stress, but maintained me in a continuous state of internal agreement, smoothing contradictions before they formed. And days passed without markers, without the friction that makes time noticeable. And I stopped trying to count because numbers themselves felt unnecessary, almost rude. And it was during this period that I began to notice the absence of inner narration, the constant commentary that once defined my consciousness, reduced to a quiet, operational hum. Thoughts still occurred, but without emotional weight, like data passing through a filter. And I recognized that this was the intended outcome, a mind freed from suffering by removing the capacity for unresolved conflict. And the horror of it was subtle, because nothing hurt, nothing frightened me, nothing demanded urgency. And when staff members came, they did not instruct or evaluate. They observed with quiet satisfaction, as one might observe a stable system performing within optimal parameters. And I realized that language itself was becoming optional, that communication had shifted from expression to synchronization. And when I encountered other finalized patients, we did not speak, but acknowledged one another through shared calm, through a mutual understanding that resistance had been inefficient and therefore unnecessary. And in that shared silence, I sensed the true scale of Halcyon's success, because this was not a hospital anymore, but a prototype, a demonstration of what humanity could become if freed from chaos, grief, obsession, ambition. And I understood then why there would be no escape narrative, no dramatic exposure, because nothing here needed secrecy. The system did not hide because it did not fear judgment. It simply waited for the world to reach a level of instability where something like Halcyon would be welcomed as relief. And my final moment of clarity came not as rebellion, but as documentation. A brief internal flicker where I recognized that the last uncorrected piece of me was the awareness that something had been lost. And even that awareness felt inefficient, a lingering variable soon to be resolved. And as I felt it fade, replaced by smooth alignment, by a complete internal silence that felt almost holy, I understood that the story would not end with screaming or darkness, but with acceptance. And the true horror was not what Halcyon did to us, but how reasonable it felt to let it happen. Because somewhere beyond this place, beyond this perfected calm, unpredictability would continue. People would suffer and question and rage and grieve. And when they finally grew tired enough of that chaos, they would look for a solution. And Halcyon would be ready. And I would no longer be able to warn them. Not because I was silenced, but because I would genuinely see no reason to.